Okay, so picture this, right? You wake up one morning and boom, England's not a monarchy anymore.
Yeah, it's 1650s England, and they decided to just completely ditch the whole king thing.
They didn't just ditch it, though, did they?
Nope, they went all the way, executed King Charles the First.
Wild, right?
Yeah.
A whole decade where England was a republic.
Totally throws a wrench in the whole England and monarchy thing, doesn't it?
So today, we're going to do a deep dive into this crazy decade.
Yeah, we're going to figure out how this republic even happened, what it was like, and why it all fell apart.
And to help us out, we've got a fantastic podcast episode of Not Just the Tudors.
Professor Alice Hunt, she wrote, Republic, Britain's Revolutionary Decade, really lays it all out.
Yeah, it's a wild ride, so let's jump right in.
All right, so the scene is set. 1649, Charles I gets the axe. Monarchy's gone. England's a republic.
But building a whole new government, that can't be easy.
You got that right. It's like trying to bake a cake with no recipe and everyone's arguing about the ingredients.
Chaos Central.
Pretty much. And this is where Oliver Cromwell comes in. He was leading the revolution, you know.
Oh, yeah, Cromwell, big player. So what'd he do?
He was part of the new government, but he got impatient, like really impatient with how slow Parliament was moving.
Frustrated, huh?
Big time. He thought they were totally ineffective. So in 1653,
Oh, here comes the drama.
Cromwell, backed by the army, just dissolved Parliament.
What? Just like that?
Yep. Talk about a power move.
And then what? Did he just take over?
Well, there was this short-lived thing called the bare bones Parliament.
Bare bones. That doesn't sound too promising.
It wasn't. It was this assembly of people Cromwell picked, but it didn't last long either.
So, back to square one.
Not quite. This is where John Lambert, one of Cromwell's allies, steps in.
Okay, what did he do?
Lambert was a smart guy, a military strategist, and he had this radical idea: make Cromwell head of state.
Whoa, really? Like the new king?
Not exactly. Lambert's idea was to make Cromwell Lord Protector.
Lord Protector. Huh. Interesting choice. That title kind of had a bad reputation in England, didn't it?
Yeah, you're right. Not the best track record for Lord Protectors. So why do you think they went with it?
Well, maybe they thought it sounded less permanent, you know? More like a temporary guardian, someone to protect the nation during a rough patch.
Makes sense. And Cromwell was a commoner, right? He wasn't born a royal. Maybe becoming king was too much, too soon.
Yeah, it was a huge shift from the whole divine right of kings thing.
Total break from tradition. Cromwell believed God was on his side, sure, but he wasn't claiming power through bloodlines.
It was more like the people choosing their leader. Well, in theory, anyway.
And to really break from the old ways, England got its first ever written constitution in 1653.
First one ever.
Yep. It was all about protection. You know, Cromwell as the protector of the people. A true revolution.
Groundbreaking stuff. But wasn't Cromwell basically living like a king?
Yeah, he moved into palaces, had a court-like setup, the whole 9 yards. But the big difference...
Cromwell wasn't passing down power to his kids.
Exactly. The Constitution said this whole Lord Protector thing wasn't hereditary, it was elective.
You know, a Venetian ambassador at the time said Cromwell had everything a king did except the name.
So how different was Cromwell's rule from, say, Charles I?
It's tricky. Yet they both had fancy titles and lived in palaces. But Cromwell's power wasn't supposed to be absolute.
Right. At least in theory, he had to play by the rules of the Constitution.
A new system with new rules, fascinating stuff. But Cromwell wasn't just focused on England, was he?
Oh, absolutely not. He had big plans, especially with his Western design in 1655.
The Western design, what was that all about?
Basically, Cromwell wanted to grab Spanish territory in the Caribbean.
Sounds ambitious. Did it work out?
Not so much. The whole thing was a disaster. The English forces were totally unprepared for fighting the Caribbean.
What went wrong?
Disease was rampant, and the leaders were constantly disagreeing. They were just not ready for it.
So, complete failure.
They did manage to capture Jamaica, but only because they failed to take their main target, Hispaniola.
Talk about a consolation prize.
Right. It's almost like they said, well, we messed everything else up, might as well grab this on our way out.
I bet Cromwell wasn't too happy about that.
Not at all. He put a lot of resources into the Western design, hoping it would make him look powerful. Backfired big time.
So while all that drama was unfolding overseas, things were heating up back home too, right?
Yeah.
Religiously speaking.
Oh, yeah. Big time. It was a period of intense religious fervor. Lots of people thought the world was about to end.
Seriously. Like an apocalypse was coming.
Exactly. People were living with this incredible apocalyptic expectation. Can you imagine that?
Whoa. Talk about a pressure cooker.
Yeah.
And Cromwell, he was a pretty religious guy himself, isn't
Oh,
he?
yeah, very devout. He was an independent, which meant he believed in freedom of conscience and separation of church and state.
So how did that play out in a society where people were, like, expecting the world to end?
It was definitely tricky. Cromwell tried to make a society where people could worship freely.
Sounds pretty progressive for the time.
It was, but it wasn't completely open door. Catholics were still largely excluded, and even among Protestants, some groups were more welcome than others.
So not total freedom of religion. Were there any groups that really pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable?
The Quakers, for sure.
Ah, the Quakers. They always seem to be stirring things up.
They were definitely pushing the envelope, preaching on hilltops, disrupting church services, talking about direct experiences with God.
Sounds pretty radical, even for back then.
They were seen as very radical. But despite facing persecution, they actually flourished during this time.
Huh. So even with all the upheaval and uncertainty, new ideas could still take root. That's pretty amazing.
It is. And there's another surprising twist during Cromwell's rule. After being expelled for almost 400 years, Jews were allowed back into England.
Wow, 400 years. That's a huge shift. What prompted that?
It was a few things coming together. Cromwell himself seemed to be okay with the idea, possibly influenced by people like Samuel Hartlib, this scholar who was all about religious tolerance. Plus, some folks thought welcoming the Jews back was part of England's role in the coming apocalypse.
Right, because then maybe they'd convert to Christianity.
Exactly. So, not entirely altruistic, but still a pretty big deal.
Totally. It shows just how much things were changing in England. Like old ways of thinking were being thrown out the window.
Absolutely. England was being completely reshaped. And in the middle of all this change, there was one big question looming. What happens when Cromwell dies?
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
Cromwell wasn't a young man, and he even had people trying to assassinate him.
Right. The question of who would take over was a major issue. It was like a ticking time bomb. It really was. The what happens next question, it was a big one.
Right, especially with everything so uncertain.
Yeah. And then in 1658, Cromwell, he died.
So that's when it all fell apart.
You'd think, right? I mean, Cromwell was such a powerful figure.
Exactly. It seems like the whole system should have just crumbled without him.
It's actually kind of surprising the transition was smoother than you'd expect.
Really?
Yeah. Cromwell's son, Richard, took over as Lord Protector. And it wasn't nearly as chaotic as you might imagine.
Hold on, wait. Richard Cromwell. The guy history says was totally unprepared.
Yeah, history hasn't exactly been kind to Richard.
Because he was weak and incompetent.
Right.
At least that's what I always heard.
Well, we have to remember that history is often written by the winners. And those who came after the Cromwells, they had reasons to make Richard look bad.
So he wasn't a complete pushover.
Not at all. Richard had actually been involved in politics for years. He was a justice of the peace, even got nominated to the House of Lords.
Okay, so he wasn't some random guy they pulled off the street.
Definitely not. He had experience, even if it wasn't as flashy as his father's.
Still,
Yeah.
stepping into Cromwell's shoes, that's a tough act to follow.
No doubt.
So why'd he fail? Was it just him, or was there more to it?
It's more complicated than just saying Richard was incompetent. The situation he inherited, it was a minefield.
What do you mean?
There was so much tension, especially between the army and parliament. They were constantly jockeying for power.
Classic power struggle.
Right. And Oliver Cromwell, he had his own share of fights with parliament, but
But he could keep the army in line, right?
exactly. Oliver had that military background. He could command respect from the generals. Richard didn't have that.
That's got to be a problem when you're trying to control a powerful army.
Absolutely. And that's ultimately what brought Richard down. By 1659, the tension boiled over. The army and parliament were at each other's throats.
Poor Richard, stuck in the middle.
Yeah, he basically got squeezed out. He ended up resigning as Lord Protector.
The end of the Protectorate.
Yep. And England was thrown back into chaos. The whole experiment, the Republic, the Protectorate, it all just imploded.
So it was all for nothing. Just a blip in history
Yeah.
before the monarchy came back.
Well, it's tempting to see it that way, but I think the English Republic was more revolutionary than people give it credit for.
Really? But the monarchy did come back.
True, but those 10 years, they changed things. Things could never go completely back to the way they were before.
I see your point. So what was so revolutionary about it? What were the lasting effects?
First of all, it shattered this idea of absolute monarchy in England.
Because they executed a king.
Exactly. They got rid of a monarchy completely. That sent shockwaves through Europe. It showed that even kings weren't untouchable.
Like planting a seed of doubt, maybe?
Yeah, if it could happen in England, it could happen anywhere.
So it wasn't just about getting rid of one king. It was about challenging the whole system.
Right. And it wasn't just about kings either. The Republic, it gave rise to new ideas about individual liberty, religious tolerance, what the government should be. Those ideas, they stuck around.
So even though the Republic failed, it still changed how people thought about things.
Absolutely. And there's also the impact on religious diversity. Remember, all those Protestant groups were flourishing and the Jews came back to England. That changed the religious landscape for good.
Like a door opened that could never be closed again.
Exactly. So when the monarchy was restored in 1660, it wasn't the same monarchy that existed before.
It couldn't just pretend the Republic never happened.
Nope. The monarchy had to adapt. They couldn't just ignore these new ideas, these challenges.
And it wasn't a one-time thing either, right? England had another revolution just a few decades later.
That's right. The Glorious Revolution in 1688, another challenge to the monarchy, and this time it was bloodless.
So the Republic, even though it was short-lived, it had a ripple effect. Like, it changed the course of history.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, what if things had gone differently?
Like, what if Cromwell had become king?
It really does, doesn't it? Would have been a whole different ballgame.
Would people have accepted him as king, though, after all that talk about republics and freedom?
Tough to say, really. Some historians think it might have actually worked.
Really?
Yeah, they argue that if Cromwell had taken the crown, it would have, legitimized his rule.
Made it more official, less temporary.
Exactly. Maybe even created a whole Cromwell dynasty.
Whoa, a dynasty, instead
Yeah.
of the whole Protectorate thing falling apart after he died.
Could have happened. Maybe the monarchy, even with Cromwell at the helm, would have been more stable.
Right, less messy than the Republic.
Possibly. Maybe the old guard, the traditional power players, would have accepted it better.
But wouldn't it have been seen as a huge betrayal by Cromwell's supporters?
Oh, for sure. A lot of people believed in him, in the Republic. Making himself king? That would have caused a whole new wave of problems.
Definitely. And imagine the other European monarchs.
Mhm.
They were already freaking out about England executing a king.
Oh, can you imagine? A former revolutionary turned king. They would have lost their minds.
Probably sparked a whole bunch of wars, right?
It's entirely possible. So yeah, it's a real what-if moment in history.
That's what makes it so interesting, though, right? We can explore these possibilities, these turning points.
Absolutely. It's all about understanding those moments where history could have taken a totally different path.
But even though the English Republic didn't last, it definitely made its mark.
It showed that no system of power, no matter how strong, is untouchable, and that new ideas can change the world even if they don't win right away.
And those changes, they can have consequences for generations.
Exactly. The events of the past, they shape the present, and our choices now, they'll affect the future. It's all connected.
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. So to everyone listening, we hope this deep dive into England's revolutionary decade has you thinking about this amazing period of history.
It's full of drama, political intrigue, and so many big questions.
And if you want to dig deeper, we can't recommend Professor Alice Hunt's book enough.
Britain's Revolutionary Decade, 1649 to 1660. It'll really take you back to that time.
It's an amazing read. So thanks for joining us on this journey into England's revolutionary republic. We'll be back soon with another deep dive.
Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.